As I mentioned last week, we're going to start a study of the minor prophets over the next several weeks, and I don't know exactly when I will end it. I will be gone a little bit this summer, and then since there are 12 books, it would make sense to do one per Sunday, but some don't lend themselves just to one Sunday, so we'll see how it works out. But at least for the summer, we'll be covering the minor prophets. And remember, the minor prophets are only minor because their books are shorter than the major prophets. That doesn't mean that they're unimportant. Before we launch into our study of Hosea this morning, let's pray together. God, you're so good to us, and we praise you for this beautiful day. We pray that you'll be glorified in all that we do. This is your day, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. Father, help us as we study from these prophets, that we will hear your word speak to us, and that we will repent and turn to you and accept your love and mercy. Father, thank you for this congregation and the opportunity we have to learn to love each other in a concrete way. And I pray, Father, that we will be known as a congregation that loves people, and that loves you and loves your word. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So last week, I first introduced you to the prophets of Israel as indicated in the scriptures, and said we won't be looking at Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, or Daniel. We're going to start off with Hosea. And I'm going to be referring back to this table a lot during the class because it's helpful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it helps you see to whom the prophet spoke. So we're talking about Hosea today. So Hosea is talking to Israel. That's the northern kingdom. So this is after the division of Israel into a southern kingdom and northern kingdom. The northern kingdom is Israel. The southern kingdom, of course, is Judah. And then it's pre-exile. So this means before the Assyrians had come in and destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. So Hosea is speaking to a people who are facing the potential of invasion and destruction, but who haven't seen it yet. Now that's going to be contrasted with when we look at Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, who are post-exile. So after the fact, after the nations have come in and taken over. We looked at this last week, which is a listing of the Hebrew scriptures according to the Jewish reckoning. And so the minor prophets are called the Book of the 12 or the 12. And you'll notice they go Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, and so forth. That's the way we're going to do them this summer. So I'm going to start with Hosea today. By the way, last week somebody asked me about the 5 rolls or 5 scrolls. And they're always grouped together. The Megillah, they're called. And nobody exactly knows why, just those 5. But they are considered their own unit. So anyway, I put it on the screen last week and I didn't know myself what it was. So remember, we're talking about a divided nation. We've got Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Jerusalem, importantly, is in Judah. And so if you're going to maintain your worship to God, and yet you don't have Jerusalem, you got to figure out some other way. And that's part of the problem with Israel and its worship, is that it's always going to be a little bit off and sometimes very off, because ultimately it has rejected Jerusalem, which is the city of David. And so it's no longer seen in the lineage of David according to the Bible. Somebody told me last week when I said, I'll refer to this once and then move past it, how much I love this screen. And somebody told me, well, just use the screen. So I'm going to. So Hosea is where we're going to start. And then, Lord willing, next week we'll tap Joel and then Amos and move through here. Also, occasionally I'll refer to this timeline because it's at least helpful to me. Hopefully you can make out a lot of it to see the timeline of the prophets. So after the division of the kingdom in the north and south, you'll see that you have kings listed, the southern kings here, and the northern kings here. So this is the kings of Israel. You start with Jeroboam, the first king of Israel. And we'll read a little bit about him in a minute. When we get to the time of Hosea, Hosea begins by mentioning specific kings of Israel and of Judah. So we can place Hosea very clearly in time. One last thing I'd like to do is look at 1 Kings 12 to see when the nation separated and see what we could know about the northern kingdom just from really 1 Kings 12 and the next few chapters, but we'll just look at a few verses in 1 Kings 12. So the king of all Israel, starting in 1 Kings 12, is Rehoboam. But before 1 Kings 12 is over, Jeroboam has now taken the 10 northern tribes and he's declared king. So when all the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. That's the northern part. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. From there he went out and built up Peniel. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel, and the other one in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. So, referring to this map of the northern and southern kingdom, it mentions a few places. He mentioned Shechem here. Notice Bethel. This is kind of set up as kind of a new Jerusalem, if you will. It's a place of worship. He also mentions that they set up an altar at Dan. So there's a biblical phrase from Dan to Beersheba. Let's see, I don't think Beersheba, yeah it is. So from the north all the way to the south, from Dan to Beersheba. Well, after the division of the kingdom, Dan is up here, isolated from the south. And so instead of having the people go on their, go to the religious festivals in Jerusalem, now he's saying, no, you can just go to Bethel, or you can go up to Dan. It's more user-friendly, that it keeps them from having to go down to Jerusalem and maybe be turned back to the will of Rehoboam. That's the idea. It also introduces the concept that they're now worshiping in the wrong place and worshiping in the wrong way, and ultimately worshiping other gods. So I think that's enough preface so we can jump right into Hosea. And let me just say this. My plan is not to cover all of Hosea verse by verse like I usually do. There are 14 chapters to Hosea. So we'd be here a very long time with the minor prophets if I did this for every single book. And secondly, because Hosea has a lot, and I mean a lot, of the condemnation of Israel. I mean, most of Hosea is just another way of saying Israel has done this wrong thing and I reject them. That's most of Hosea, with a few bright spots in between. So we're not going to look at all of Hosea. Instead, I'm going to try to hit up some of the major points so we can get the idea of what Hosea is really about. We will read a lot of chapter 1 and chapter 2 and significant portions of others, but we can't do the whole book, not at least, and get done in a reasonable amount of time. So Hosea 1:1. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. So he starts off and says that the word of the Lord that came to Hosea. So this is a way of saying Hosea became a prophet. And we'll see this. I think Malachi starts that way. Maybe Haggai starts that way. Anyway, some of the other prophetic books will begin the same way. The word of the Lord came to so-and-so. And that means it's time to be a prophet. And you'll see in lots of the prophetic literature, so Ezekiel and Isaiah, it'll say things about how the word of the Lord says this and that. So it's clear this is God saying, this man is now my prophet, and he's going to speak for me. So his name is Hosea, which means salvation. It's related to Joshua. So they come from the same root word, and both have to do with salvation. But we don't know a whole lot about Hosea. It says that he's the son of Beeri, but we're not sure exactly who that is. So there are different traditions out there. There's a tradition among the Jews that Beeri was also a prophet, but honestly we don't know a whole lot about that. But verse 1 is very helpful for us in letting us know about the prophet Hosea, but also the time period that Hosea worked. So you've got the northern kingdom and their kings, or the kings of Judah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, and then Jeroboam is the king of Israel, the northern kingdom. This is Jeroboam the second. So again, going back to this timeline, so notice it says Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, this is our time period right here. So before and after 750 BC, and then it's the reign of Jeroboam II. So this kind of places them in this time period, and over several decades. So that means Hosea was a prophet for maybe as many as 60 years. So he lived the life of a prophet, and oftentimes to live the life of a prophet is to lead a life of pain and rejection. And that's exactly what Hosea gets to do. So I'm assuming everybody here is familiar with the book of Hosea. But if you're not, buckle up, because it is surprising. I know the very first time I read Hosea, I could not believe what I was reading. And I'm just looking, making sure there's nobody too young of an age in this class, because it's a very graphic book. Okay? Enough said, let's read verse 2. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Okay, so we've got the command of God for Hosea to go do something. Now you'll notice when God speaks to prophets and he says, go do this thing, sometimes it's an odd thing. I primarily am thinking of Ezekiel. We're not going to study Ezekiel, but Ezekiel is told to do some really bizarre things. But I got to say, I don't think any of them top this. So he is commanded to go marry a promiscuous woman. It's almost like the book of Hosea is a little bit too on point, because it's real easy to get this metaphor. Israel, you are like a prostitute, and you're always selling yourself to the highest bidder. That's the way you treat me. You're always leaving me and going to another man. I mean, that's exactly what the imagery is. Now, notice the NIV says marry a promiscuous woman. This is going to be a distinction probably without a difference, and a lot of the more modern translations are going with promiscuous rather than, I'll show you the other translations. And that's because it's not clear from the language itself, from the original Hebrew, whether or not it's saying she was already promiscuous beforehand, and specifically whether she was a prostitute before she came to Hosea, or this happened afterward. Okay? And it kind of could work with the story either way. The language just isn't specific enough, and so there are different people who say different things. Bob McCloy gifted me a couple of books this morning, one called The Minor Prophets, and I just happened to look right before class and see it. It mentions this very fact. We don't know if she was this way before or after, but the point being, obviously, she's that way. So we read from the NIV, the New Living Translation says, go marry a prostitute. English Standard Version, go take yourself a wife of whoredom. King James also says, wife of whoredoms. New King James, a wife of harlotry. And New American Standard, a wife inclined to infidelity. So you get the point, right? It's not necessarily that she's, standing on street corners. I don't know exactly how prostitution worked in ancient Israel, okay? But it's not necessarily she's that way. She's just going to be the kind of person you can't trust, who's always going to be stepping out. But it could be that she literally is a prostitute, and so he's going and marrying this woman who's already loose, and he knows it. I think either way fits, because the emphasis is on this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. So it's all about Israel's unfaithfulness. And remember what Jeroboam the first did. First thing he did when he set up Israel is he started to establish his own kind of worship, and certainly it included bringing in worship from outside nations. So you see this over and over in Hosea. And we'll look at some of the places where it talks about that. So Hosea is told to go marry Gomer. Let's go ahead and get this out of the way. This is what we all think of when we hear Gomer. We first think of, golly, right? You can't help it. But let's move past that. Gomer probably was a beautiful lady. We don't know a lot about her either. Again, there's some traditions about Diblaim. Some say that's her mother, not her father, and that her mother was also a prostitute. But again, we don't know. Probably her father, but it probably doesn't matter a whole lot to the story. What does matter is what happens next, is that they marry and have a son. So if it is the case that she was a prostitute beforehand and he already knew this way, then probably what Hosea is thinking is, all right, she's going to leave that life now that she's married me, and now she's going to be faithful only to me. But Hosea has to feel what God feels in some way. So for him to truly be a prophet, he has to suffer like God suffers. That's kind of the idea. So they have a son, and this is where it gets even weirder. The Lord said to Hosea, "Call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the Valley of Jezreel." All of a sudden I couldn't decide if it was bow or bow, but I know it's bow. It's for war. "I will break Israel's bow in the Valley of Jezreel." So this starts a pattern. They're going to have 3 children. Each child gets a name, a very negative name. Now the first one isn't by necessity a bad thing, because it's Jezreel, and when the people of Israel think of the Valley of Jezreel, they're actually thinking about a beautiful, fertile valley that kind of serves as a breadbasket for Israel. So they wouldn't necessarily associate Jezreel with a bad thing, except God says, "You're naming this child Jezreel because of the massacre at Jezreel. Jehu is responsible for." So this is one of those times when it's a little bit of a puzzle, because if you go back and read what Jehu did, I think it's in 2 Kings, and I'm trying to remember the chapter. It's not off the top of my head, the chapters. Jehu, in many ways, is lauded as being a good king and being a prophet. So that he did what he was supposed to do, and specifically, he struck down Ahab and Ahab's house. But in the process of doing that, I mean, he goes through and he's slaughtering people left and right. Again, God kind of commends him for it, if you read about it. So it's a little bit of a puzzle that he'd be singled out as one who was responsible for a massacre at Jezreel. But it's clear that 2 things can be true at the same time. And that is that in the Old Testament, you can have a man who is after God's own heart and yet have lots of blood on his hands. Right? Remember, David fit that perfectly. So David didn't get to build a temple. Why? He was a man of violence. So on the one hand, Jehu seemed to do God's will. He was told to wipe out the house of Ahab. He did that. But on the other hand, he was a man of war, and he was guilty of a lot of bloodshed. And so it seems that this massacre at Jezreel is just saying, look, you're in a land of violence. And so this child is going to remind you of that. So let's talk about the Valley of Jezreel just for a second. So you can see here, it's again in the northern part. Here's the Sea of Galilee in the northern part of Israel. And so it's in the northern kingdom. I like this kind of 3D imagery to show you. If you're coming in from the Mediterranean, you can see how the Jezreel Valley opens up there. And you certainly can't be planting stuff over here, but here you have this lush valley. It's a river valley even. So, let's move on. Verse 6. Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. The Lord said to Hosea, "Call her Lo Ruhamah, which means not loved. For I will no longer show love to Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but I, the Lord their God, will save them." After she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said, "Call him Lo Ami, which means not my people. For you are not my people, and I am not your God." Okay? So, of course, names in the Old Testament were always significant. You know, you set up a child kind of like their destiny with their name oftentimes. And these children are purposely given very bad names. So the first one, well, if you just had the Ruhamah part, that would be pretty good because it means loved or beloved. But the Lo part means no or not. So, not loved. I don't love you. What a great name for a kid, right? And then the son's born, Lo Ami. So Am means people. Ami means my people. Lo Ami means not my people. So think of it this way. Not my son. So you're not loved and you are not my son. It'd be great to go through life. You remember the Johnny Cash song, A Boy Named Sue? You know, I wasn't going to be around, so I had to give you this name to make you tough. Now, I'd like to think that Hosea tried to be a good parent and explain to his children, hey, this is your technical name. I'm going to call you by your nickname, all right? And I want you to understand that you are loved. I'd like to think that happened in their home. We don't really get to know that part of the story. We're told this because of God's experience with Israel. And so, it seems that God is saying to Israel, I know that I have loved you. And I know I have been your God and you have been my people. But that's over. I'm done with it. And thus begins the cycle that you'll see throughout the book of Hosea, where God seems to say, it's over. I'm done with you, Israel. No more. Finally, I'm rid of you and your profligate ways. It seems that that's happening. And then invariably, but God will say, how could I possibly do that? And so you see little turns along the way. So we've got the two names of the kids that indicate what God says he is doing with Israel. You are not my people, I am not your God. So I mentioned a few years ago that I taught Hebrew at MTSU for a year. And I had a couple of Jewish students in there. And they wanted to learn Hebrew to, kind of connect with their heritage. And by the way, most of the students in there were Christian, and they wanted to learn Hebrew to connect with their heritage. Okay, so everybody was in there to learn some Hebrew because of their history. And I do remember one very delightful young lady who was shocked when in class we read this section from Hosea about Lo Ami, you are not my people, and I'm not your God. Because, she'd grown up again in a Jewish household, and one of the things is we are God's people. And she didn't realize that God had ever said, you're not my people. And of course, she thought it was pretty cruel to name a child that too. So I remember having this discussion in class. I don't remember what happened after that, but I do remember it kind of standing out to me. So every time I think of Hosea, I think of Lo Ami and that conversation. So let's move on to Hosea chapter 2, and you start to see what, again, I call the cycle, where the scriptures are going to mention over and over and over again Israel's sins. Say of your brothers, my people, and of your sisters, my loved one. Notice now we've gone from not my people and not loved to say to my people and my beloved or my loved one. Say to these people, who used to be that for me. Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. Verse 4, I will not show my love to her children, because they are children of adultery. Verse 7, she will chase after her lovers, but not catch them. She will look for them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my husband as at first, for then I was better off than now. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for Baal. So, what Hosea is saying here is that, like an adulterous wife, Israel has stepped out on me. And she's basically left me and the kids, and wanted to live her own sinful life, and then realized, wait, I had it better back at home. But she never really acknowledged what she had. She never really came back in much repentance, that kind of thing. And ironically, the very things that I gave Israel, God says, I gave them new wine and oil and grain, silver and gold, all these things to bless them. What do? They turn around and they use it for idol worship. So they used for Baal. We'll talk more about Baal in just a moment. Verse 9, therefore I will take away my grain when it ripens, and my new wine when it is ready. I will take back my wool and my linen, intended to cover her naked body. So now I will expose her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers. No one will take her out of my hands. I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all her appointed festivals. I will ruin her vines and her figs, which she said were her pay from her lovers. I will make them a thicket, and wild animals will devour them. I will punish her for the days she burned incense to the Baals. So again, condemnation. And like I said, this is most of the next several chapters. So it's a threat. And now you're envisioning this happening to a woman, but it's really his metaphor for Israel. So this lewd woman is now going to have her nakedness exposed to everyone, point being that Israel is about to be exposed. And so this lush, fertile land that God gave them is about to be destitute. And he's going to show them what it means to be without, because they've left their first love. And again, we have reference to Baals, Canaanite gods. But notice in verse 14, therefore I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards and will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. Then she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. So notice, Hosea is pointing towards Israel coming back. Israel being reinstated, coming back to her husband. And so you kind of think, all right, so now the problem's solved, except we're just starting a cycle here. And so it's going to go again and again in Hosea that God is going to say, I reject you because you have departed from me and you've been unfaithful to me and you've been sacrificing to Baals, you've been worshiping these other gods and doing all kinds of detestable things. But how can I do anything but take you back when you come to me? You see this over and over again. Verse 18, in that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the fields, the birds in the sky, and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth. So this is this beautiful picture of Israel finally receiving its consummation. Israel coming, and there be no more wars, right? So bow and sword are abolished. And even the beasts of the field, you can lie down with them. So they've got this beautiful imagery of a restored, a renewed earth. Here's the thing. Israel never got to see this. Remember, Hosea's prophesying pre-exile. And Israel never really turns back to God. Not wholeheartedly, not completely. And so what happens is, invariably, they face judgment. For them, judgment is a literal invasion by the Assyrians. But this is what God is pointing to what he wants to give them. And these kind of promises found throughout the Old Testament kind of serve as the basis for our Christian hope. And, I've been listening to David Young now. We moved here in 2005, so I guess for 17 years. And I can tell you some of his greatest hits. I know you can too. But doesn't he love to talk about places where God says, I'm going to restore Israel? He said, and I'm going to plant. David loves this part of Scriptures where it says, it's going to be so fertile and be so good, the land is, that the guy who's picking will move ahead of the guy who's planting. Right? You're going to be drinking wine that's so good, you can't get enough of it. It's just going to be so awesome, that kind of thing. And so God is saying that, even though I've rejected you, even though you're not my people, come, you'll be betrothed to me forever. We'll be husband and wife like we're supposed to be, forever, he says. And then continuing in chapter 2, and the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine, and the olive oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. So again, it seems like we kind of have the whole thing done in the first two chapters. But really, we're just getting started. So now let's look at chapter 3. The Lord said to me, go show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to the other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way towards you. For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days. So notice, this is anticipating the fact that Gomer, we aren't told this part in the story, but it's clearly implied that Gomer has left Hosea. So she has these children, and now she's left him, and apparently she's married someone else. And the reason I say that is because Hosea has to buy her back. Now, she might have become a slave, kind of a sex slave, maybe. But the point is that even though she's his wife, he has to buy her again, which is an Old Testament kind of way of thinking. And we know that Gomer's sin is really a reflection of Israel's sin. Though they turned to other gods and loved the sacred raisin cakes. Now, I don't know if you're a fan of Little Debbie like I am. That's not saying Little Debbie is a sin, okay? These sacred raisin cakes were clearly involved in some kind of religious rituals with these Baals and with these foreign gods. So it mentions that. It mentions, he says, look, you're going to live with me, Israel, like Gomer's living with Hosea. But it says, you're going to live without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones. And what you see in the latter part of Israel is that things kind of go crazy. And they don't really, have a king who has any authority, and things are starting to go off the wheels, and that's when Assyria can really come in and take over. And so he mentions this. He says, without sacrifice or sacred stones. So it wasn't that Israel, the northern kingdom, was exempt of religion. There was plenty of religion around. Lots of sacrificing going on, lots of altars and things like that. Lots of, he even mentions household gods, lots of priests, that kind of thing. And they were clearly mixing in the worship of the one true God of Israel with these other forms of worship, because he mentions the fact that you keep your Sabbaths, that kind of thing. So they've kind of conjured up their own religion. And what God says is, in these last days, before the last days happen, you're going to lose. It's going to be so chaotic you can't even worship. And then he says, then you're going to return to me trembling in the last days. Again, Old Testament imagery that in the New Testament is taken up by lots of New Testament writers to refer to the return of Jesus. So it goes from being a warning about just the invasion of Assyria, and actually can point to the return of Jesus. So in chapter 4, we see some of the sins of Israel pointed out. Chapter 4, verse 1. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying and murder, stealing and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. So I'm struck by the fact that this is clearly a violent place. It's a place of deceit and dishonesty and that kind of thing. And in many ways you can look and see, a reflection of our world there. But you notice what he started with? No faithfulness, no love. Any society that doesn't have faithfulness and love, guess what? It's not going to acknowledge God. It's going to have lying and murder and stealing and bloodshed. No faithfulness, no love. Israel needed both. But Hosea was experiencing what it's like to have a wife who's not faithful and who doesn't love you. And that's what God was experiencing. So now in chapter 5, we see Ephraim invoked. So let's read our few verses from chapter 5, and then I'll talk about those. He says, I know all about Ephraim. Israel is not hidden from me. Ephraim, you have now turned to prostitution. Israel is corrupt. So he says in verse 9, Ephraim will be laid waste on the days of reckoning. Among the tribes of Israel, I proclaim what is certain. Judah's leaders are like those who move boundary stones. I will pour out my wrath on them like a flood of water. Ephraim is oppressed, trampled in judgment, intent on pursuing idols. I'm like a moth to Ephraim, like a rot to the people of Judah. When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his sores, then Ephraim turned to Assyria and sent to the great king for help. But he is not able to cure you, not able to heal your sores. So I'm going to go back here just for a second. So Ephraim, this is important kind of knowledge for all of us students of the Old Testament. Whenever Ephraim is invoked, especially in the prophets, it's just another way of referring to the northern kingdom of Israel. So he's using them, you can see here, he uses Ephraim, then Israel, then Ephraim, then Israel. You can see how he's talking about Israel, and this is another way. So you'll see that Ephraim is used to describe the northern kingdom, so is Joseph. So this is just one way, another way to say the northern kingdom. But it's not just talking about the northern kingdom, and I hope I haven't given the impression that when an Old Testament prophet is preaching to one group of people, that means he doesn't talk about any others. Because clearly here, Judah has some blame too. It says here, Judah's leaders, so that's the southern kingdom, are like those who move boundary stones. Clearly, moving boundary stones is a big deal. It's a big no-no. Just read about it in the book of Proverbs, how much of a sin it is. And then it says here in verse 13, when Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his sores. So notice, Judah is also afflicted here. Ephraim turns to Assyria. So that's part of what you see throughout, the ancient wars is oftentimes it wasn't just that an invader came in and took over everything, but that some people had already sided with the invaders. And so more and more people in Israel were looking to Assyria for help and for answers and religion and that kind of thing. So Assyria was beginning to dominate that region more and more. So again, another map of the northern and southern kingdoms. And the reason I wanted to use this one is because you can see up here to the northeast, you have the kingdom of Aram or Aram Damascus. So Damascus there, which is in modern day Syria. In the New Testament times, it's in Syria. But you can see it's right on the edge of the Assyrian Empire, one of the great empires of the ancient world. And so ultimately, Assyria will come through here and take over all this land. But Israel's already flirting with Assyria. Hosea says, you've gone to Assyria's king to look for answers. So they've already kind of allowed Assyria to have a big influence there. More of the cycle is repeated. Chapter 7. Whenever I would heal Israel, the sins of Ephraim are exposed, the crimes of Samaria revealed. So Samaria was the capital city of the northern kingdom. They practiced deceit, thieves break into houses, bandits rob in the streets. But they don't realize that I remember all their evil deeds. Their sins engulf them. They are always before me. So you can see what a corrupt place this is. But then, again, there are cycles. So we come to chapter 11, verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now, maybe that sounds familiar to you. We'll talk about it in just a moment. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals and burned incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms, but they did not realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. To them I was like one who lifts a little child to the cheek and bent down to feed them. So he's talking about how he chose Israel and loved Israel like this little baby, like this little child. And how he showed love and affection, and Israel turned on him. But did you notice in chapter 11, verse 1, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. So remember how the story of the Exodus, out of Egypt, Israel was called. But you might recognize that because Matthew quotes this in really kind of in an unexpected way. Remember at the birth of Jesus? So in Matthew 2 it says, when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. This is one of those places where it's a real interesting study on how Matthew uses the Old Testament. And it's clear that the immediate context of Hosea 11 is we're talking about the nation of Israel. And so Israel was God's son. Israel was called out of Egypt. But what Matthew says is this also kind of portended the idea that Jesus was going to come out of Egypt. And so Matthew sees maybe a play on words here, that kind of thing. So that part might have been familiar to you. There's some other parts of Hosea 11 that also might be familiar. He mentions here the Baals. So sometimes in the Old Testament, Baal is one god, a Canaanite god, and so you see, prophets go to, kind of go to war against Baal. Sometimes Baals are plural, and they're many gods. And that's because in the ancient context, it's clear that in some Baal was more of a catch-all word. So it could refer to more local deities, or it could refer to kind of, the one god that they envisioned. So they had local Baals, they had kind of, area kind of Baals. So these are different Baals that have been found. So images, statues that were used to worship. And remember it said when Jeroboam started the northern kingdom, he said, here you go, worship this golden calf, which obviously was hearkening back to what had happened in Exodus. But here we have the idea that there are these Baals all around, and all the nations around Israel are using them, and Israel has also been using them. In chapter 11, he goes on in verse 8 and says, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I devastate Ephraim again. For I am God and not a man, the Holy One among you. I will not come against their cities. They will follow the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children will come trembling from the west. They will come from Egypt, trembling like sparrows, from Assyria, fluttering like doves. I will settle them in their homes, declares the Lord. So, we see again in chapter 11 this turn of, even though Israel has left me, even though Ephraim has rejected me, how can I give you up? So over and over again, it's like God is wrestling with himself and saying, but I love you too much. And so I can't give up on you yet. So what seems like final condemnation is not, and God will take them back again and again. And that's what we know of the people of God in the Old Testament, isn't it? It's this constant cycle of blessing, and then departure, sin, and punishment, and repentance. And we do it all over again. And you're seeing that being played out in Hosea. So Hosea has lived this life married to an unfaithful woman, experiencing what it's like to be God, who over and over again has said, I love you too much to leave you, even though I should leave you, he says. And so, to conclude, the book of Hosea ends with these verses. So again, it's not one of those books that's going to tell you exactly what's going to happen, because this is a pre-exile book. So this is before the Assyrians take over, and it's clear that in Hosea's lifetime, Israel still had the opportunity to turn back to their God and not face this judgment. But ultimately, we know they didn't. So it ends with, who is wise? Let them realize these things. Who is discerning? Let them understand. The ways of the Lord are right. The righteous walk in them, but the rebellious stumble in them. So he's saying, now Israel, I leave it to you. Are you going to be in the righteous walk of the Lord? Or are you going to be rebelliously stumbling all over his commands? That's probably a good place for us to end as well, to remember that the ways of the Lord are right, and that the righteous walk in them. I hope you have a blessed rest of the day. Thanks so much for your attendance. You're dismissed.